Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the value of assigning writing that isn't graded. So I'm talking about this based on The Elements of Teaching Writing by Catherine Gottschalk and Keith Shortshaw, whose names I may be mispronouncing. If I am, I apologize. So they have this short section here called Assigning Writing That Is Not Graded or Even Read. And I think this is a thing that many instructors are not that keen on doing, in part because we work off of the assumption, and it's a very reasonable assumption, that if something is not graded, students will not do it or will not put that much effort into it. And that may be true. Those are fair concerns. That's part of the reason why I always do graded peer reviews, is because I think that's an incredibly important component of the writing process. And I want students to A, actually do it, and B, take it seriously when they do it. And there is an intuitive assumption that if something is graded, students will put more effort into it. The problem with this logic is, one problem is that this assumes that students are only concerned about grades. Now, that's not inherently wrong. There are many, many students who are primarily motivated by grades, as anyone who's been teaching for a while will be able to tell you. But if we, as instructors or as educational institutions or whatever it is, reinforce the belief that education is primarily about getting grades, then students will have no reason ever to doubt this. The other big issue with this, this book was published in, let me check this really quickly, 2004. Since 2004, higher education, and I think this is probably true of primary education as well, so elementary school, middle school, high school, but I don't work in those at those levels, so I don't know this for sure. Higher education has become substantially more quantitative. More quantitative. In that, higher education has become much more driven by measurable objectives and outcomes. Every accrediting board, every whatever it is, who sort of assesses universities and how successful they are, is looking at quantitative outcomes, measurable results. And so what they want from us as instructors is to create measurable metrics that our students can either meet or fail to meet. Which means that there is an institutional or practical incentive to grade things, because then we have the data to say, yes, our students have met the measurable outcome requirements. This is a profound problem with higher education, which I don't want to get that much into, although I'll probably make a different video about why I think this is a problem. But this need to quantify results and measure things objectively does work against the impulse to give students non-graded work. But there is a profound freedom in non-graded written work. So one thing that the authors here say, Gottschalk and Shortshaw. Sorry, again. One thing that the authors say is, the general principle we want to stress is that the potential benefits of writing extend well beyond its use as an object of evaluation. Everything students write does not have to pass through a system of exchange that converts its value ultimately to a grade. And I think that's a really important principle. There are huge values to having students do opening free writes that don't get assessed, to have them do brainstorming exercises that you don't collect and give a grade to having them free write about topics, to having them draft multiple thesis statements or outlines or whatever it is. Spend 10 minutes in class writing a counter argument to the essay that you read for homework. I'm not going to collect it. I'm not going to grade it. I want you to practice these skills in an environment where you do not have the pressure of grades. Because if you have the pressure of grades, one problem with this is that inevitably impacts the process through which you write, the approach that you take, and it limits your ability to be creative, flexible, unique, experimental, right? Because I had a professor as an undergrad, and the rumor about this professor was that what you needed to do to get a good grade in the class was to put in your essay whatever it was he had said in lecture about this text, right? That was the rumor. That was the advice that all of the other English majors who had taken classes with this guy gave. Incidentally, he gave me my favorite piece of feedback I've ever gotten on anything I've ever written, which is that I am conspicuously competent. So yeah, that's super fun, and I've always wanted to give that feedback, but I've never felt like that was probably a good idea in my position as a non-tenure track contingent faculty member. But that's a separate story. But anyway, so this was the thing, right? Was that in order to get a good grade, you had to say what this guy thought about these pieces of literature. And so the exercise was not, can I build a good, compelling argument expressing my analytical understanding of this text? The exercise was, what does the professor want? And this is the big problem with grading, right? It creates an incentive in students' minds, even if we as instructors want to pretend that this is not the case, even if we tell our students, I'm not looking for you to say whatever I want said. And I think in many ways that's true, right? Like, if a student takes a position on a topic that maybe we profoundly disagree with, we nonetheless have a professional obligation to assess the argument itself as an argument and to grade it as such, rather than to grade it in terms, or assess it or give feedback to it or whatever it is, in terms of, I disagree with this, right? But when students know that something is not going to be graded, not going to be collected, not even going to be read by the instructor, it eases that concern, right? If you, the instructor, are not going to be reading what I've written, then I don't have to write what I think you want to hear. I can say what I want to say, the way that I want to say it. And that may or may not be rhetorically effective, right? For a lot of us, our sort of intuitive, untrained, or minimally trained approach to rhetoric is not sophisticated. But that's okay, right? The very practice of doing it helps us figure out how to approach things better, right? I am a better writer today, a better rhetorician today than I was in 2005 during my first year of university, right? That's just how it goes. So having these pieces of writing work, written work, that don't get graded, don't get assessed, can be really, really beneficial because it frees students from feeling that they need to meet instructor expectations, even if those expectations don't exist on our part, right? The other thing that they say here in terms of why this is a good idea is that if you have too many students and too little time, which is the case for more of us today in higher education than it was in 2004 when this was published, There are several levels of exchange from which you can choose. Basically, this means you are overworked, underpaid, as many of us are. If you are contingent, if you have far too many students, maybe writing heavy courses, things like this, then there are ways that there are different levels that you can choose to engage with student-written materials. And so the ones that they lay out are writing that you do not collect, things like diaries, journals, free writes, etc., etc. Writing you collect and read briefly, but do not grade. Basically just sort of making sure that students have done it. Writing you collect, read briefly, and acknowledge for credit. Yes, you have done this opening free write. I've collected it. I've seen it. Cool. You get credit for having done it. I'm not assessing it. I'm not giving feedback on it. I'm not determining how good it is. It's not getting a grade, etc., etc. There's writing that you read with a few comments and grade with an alternative system. So this would be something like a check, check plus, check minus, something like that type of system where there is an assessment of it, but it is not a letter grade system. And this can be more freeing for students as well, because the sort of stakes are different than a letter grade system, right? They're trained often to think of letter grades as a way of punishing or rewarding. And so eliminating that grading schema can be quite freeing. There's writing you read with extensive comments but do not grade. This was the original system basically that I was trained under as a university instructor at University of Vermont, that we would give in-progress feedback on drafts, but we did not grade them. The final portfolio at the end of the semester was the only thing that was graded. Finished papers you evaluate with comments and grades. This is the traditional approach, right? Where you give feedback, you put a grade on it, everybody's happy, right? The fucking quantitative bullshit is happy because they have letter grades that are easy to numerically calculate. Students are happy because they have a letter grade assessment. You are probably less happy because you had to do the labor of giving extensive feedback and then putting a grade on it, etc., etc. So, but those are different tiers we can use, right? And we can sort of, again, give students greater or lesser degrees of freedom, creativity, flexibility in how we approach these assessments. The other note that these authors make that I think is really, really important, and I try and stress this across the board with my pedagogy, is it is especially important for you to explain these choices to your students when you give them writing assignments and exercises, particularly if you are not grading something in the conventional way. Students will not be that familiar with that for the most part. And so you will want to say, here is what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it, here's how this is meant to allow you to engage with this material. Because if they understand that, then they can approach it more effectively to get the benefits, qualitative benefits often, that you want them to get.